a lot of times there's fear, right? I mean, this is like saving everybody 5 years of therapy. If you really want to quickly get to a place where you can shift, be curious, ask that deeper question, but recognize that usually fear is underlying everything that we're having a hard time with.
You're listening to the Happy Doc Student Podcast, a podcast dedicated to providing clarity to the often mysterious doctoral process. Do you feel like you're losing your mind? Let me and my guests show you how to put more joy in your journey and graduate with your sanity, health, and relationships intact. I'm your host, Dr. Heather Frederick, and this is episode 17. In this episode, I speak with Dr. Gladys Ato about how to navigate the potentially heart-wrenching decision to leave a doctoral program with grace and ease and find magic on the other side. Just a real quick note, video was not recorded during this podcast due to an unstable internet connection. Gladys Ato is a leadership mentor, clinical psychologist, public speaker, grief specialist, and author of The Good Goodbye: How to Navigate Change and Loss in Life, Love, and Work. She teaches community leaders to amplify their joy in leadership in uncertain times using the Good Goodbye approach. Recognized as a Latina leader by Hispanic Executive magazine and winner of the Women Worth Watching in Education Award, Dr. Ato is featured in BBC WorkLife, Forbes, TEDx Lincoln Square, NBC News, and other top publications and podcasts. Gladys, welcome to the show.
Thank you, Heather. I'm excited to be here for a chat today.
So I was lucky enough to discover your book, The Good Goodbye, right before we moved to Arizona. So I was able to actually use your technique to help me and the girls say goodbye to our home in California. And it was really, really profound. So while your approach gives a new perspective on dealing with any significant change, the reason I wanted to have you on this show is that we know many people who start a doctoral program don't finish it.
Right.
Now, the stats vary, but the one number that gets thrown around a lot is about 50%.
Mm-hmm.
That's huge.
Yeah.
Chances are, if you're listening to this show, you're going to know someone, and that someone may be you, who makes this difficult decision to leave their program. And that is exactly why I wanted to have Gladys here today, so she could share a way to say goodbye that is incredibly empowering. How I would love to start, Gladys, is would you be willing to tell the story of how this good goodbye approach came into being?
Absolutely. It actually was a gift given to me by my mom back in 2003. She died suddenly of a brain aneurysm, and we had no warning that she was ill or anything like that. I had seen her the day before she passed away, and the next day she was gone forever. She was 54 years old, and at her funeral is where I was given this gift by her of experiencing what I refer to as a good goodbye. And in essence, that was me feeling the celebration and the joy and the acceptance and understanding of her passing at the same time that I was feeling the deep grief and devastation of losing my mom. And we often get taught that if you're grieving, you're on one end of the emotional spectrum, which is the grief and the pain and the loss or the anger, resentment, any of that. That's where grief resides. And what I want to help people understand is that we are so much more capable of not only experiencing one end of the emotional spectrum, but also encompassing the opposite end. And when we allow ourselves to fully hold both ends of the spectrum, from grief to celebration and joy, that is where we can start to move through the grieving process with a little bit more ease, because we now have another perspective that is in some ways balancing the other end of the spectrum, which can lead us down a place of getting stuck. And, for me, what I learned back then in 2003, it didn't mean that my grief was going away, because that infusion of joy and celebration and knowing my mother's deep, profound elation in her spirit state, it didn't mean that I was fine with it and didn't ever shed another tear. I, for years, was heartbroken, and yet knowing that there was that other end was a reference point for me, so that when I was going through my lowest lows, I could anchor into that highest high moment that I had experienced at her funeral. And that allowed me to not get submerged so deeply that I couldn't rise back up to the surface. So it really is a dance that we're doing. And whether we are doing it in regards to saying goodbye to a loved one, or we're saying goodbye to a decision that we made in our life, maybe we had that vision of ourselves going to graduate school, completing a doctorate program. This is something that happened to me, right? Like wanting to become a therapist and having my own private practice. But then once we get there, we realize that our preferences, our visions, our dreams shift. How do we honor the path that we took and give ourselves permission to feel that freedom and elation and joy in moving into a new threshold of expansion?
In your book, you talk about this idea that we share this collective story. We're running this program where change and loss is always negative.
Yep, absolutely. And I mean, think about it. If you think about the word goodbye, what does that provoke in you emotionally? And I did this as an experiment. I had done a survey for like over 100 people, just asking them to name the top 3 emotion words that they reference when they think of the word goodbye. And the top 3 words were sadness, anger, and anxiety. How do we look at that, right? Collectively, is why is our definition so negative? But if we look at transitions and change through a different lens, and this is something that I've shared with several folks that I work with personally as clients, is anytime we go through a transition or a loss, we are grieving, right? But we are also shifting into the beginning of a new chapter. And so this is actually a rite of passage that we're going through. And if we look at rites of passage that we're familiar with in our lives, like the birth of a new baby, becoming an adult, rites of passage like getting married, right? These are things that we celebrate. So there's no reason that we can't bring in the sacredness of going through a change or a loss and have celebration be part of that dance with the grief. And the book, The Good Goodbye, breaks down what that looks like, because I know just from me sharing what I'm sharing right now, it sounds like we're supposed to be happy, everything's great, I feel no pain. That's not the goal. The goal really is to be able to move through all the layers of how grief shows up, not excluding what's on the other end of the emotional spectrum, and to do it in a way that allows grace and compassion to rise to the surface. Because a lot of times we are so hard on ourselves, and because we're surrounded by these stories that change and loss and transitions are bad things, we end up saying things to ourselves like, I hate change. I don't want to think about loss because it makes me sad. And we're just reinforcing these collective stories that don't serve us.
And one of the things that I just loved about your book is you've got this paradigm, this perspective that just sounds wonderful. So you may be out there listening to this podcast saying, yes, show me, how can I have this heavy heart and yet at the same time celebrate that I know this is the right decision for me. And what you do is you walk the reader through 5 very clear steps. Would you be willing to go through those with us?
Absolutely. So the 5 pillars of the Good Goodbye approach are acceptance, understanding, gratitude, forgiveness, and saying goodbye. So I break it all down in the book, and I give a lot of stories, examples from people, not just my own stories, but stories from other people that have actually navigated each of these pillars in their own way as they were going through a major transition or loss. Acceptance. The reason that I start there is I wanted to create a counterintuitive approach to the 5 stages of grieving, which most of us are familiar with that, right? 5 stages of grieving: denial, anger, bargaining, depression, acceptance. There's this belief that acceptance is the final destination, and that once we cross that threshold and we accept, that's when our grieving is complete. That's when we feel at peace with everything. And what I want to present people with is what if we actually started with acceptance first and recognize that acceptance doesn't mean your grieving is complete. Acceptance doesn't mean you have no emotions towards what happened. Acceptance solely means that you recognize what has unfolded without trying to change it. And this in itself is a game changer, because when we are stuck in grief or when we resist change, it's because we're trying to hold on to something that already happened, but rework it in a way that is impossible. Like we're trying to run back to the past and play the past out in the way that we desire, but the past is already done. And so when we let go of that desire to hold on to something that already happened, we free ourselves up to focus instead on what do we want this next step forward to look like. And so it becomes a very empowering repositioning of our energy. And then from there, being able to move into understanding, which is, well, here I am right now. Right? If I made the decision that I don't want to stay in my doctoral program anymore, how do I accept that that's where I'm at? Don't judge myself, don't beat myself up over it, don't try to change it, don't try to change people's opinions. I accept that this is where I'm at. I've chosen a new crossroads and I want to go in a different direction. All right, well, let's understand where you want to go. How do you want to move through this transition? Do you want to move through this threshold in a way where you are beating yourself up, where you're feeling remorse? Mostly people want to move through this in a way where they feel more gratitude, right? They feel more acceptance, understanding. They feel at peace in their hearts. And so understanding is simply just being intentional and setting your focus on what you desire. What's the outcome that you'd like to get through as you move through this journey of change? Gratitude is that what I call in the book a healing salve for our hearts, because again, we tend to beat ourselves up so much. If we invest thousands of dollars, right? Maybe we've taken out loans to go into a doctoral program. Maybe our family's depending on us to, really make a big career out of this. And now we change our minds. We might be really hard on ourselves or even feel the pressure of others being hard on us because of expectations that they have or that we've had for ourselves. And this is where we actually can harden into more resistance. And so gratitude becomes a way where we can look at the scenario in front of us and say, what am I learning from this? What am I taking away that I can appreciate? How is this turning point, this flexion point in my life, giving me opportunities that I couldn't have had otherwise? And the beauty is that the more you stay in this place of gratitude, the more you will allow yourself to forgive. And usually forgiveness has to start with us first. Being able to forgive ourselves for changing our mind, forgiving others, right, for maybe the ways that they had expectations for us that shaped our decision making, forgiving the situation, right? This becomes a ongoing process, but we can enter it with a little bit more ease when we come with a grateful heart. The saying goodbye element, what I shared in my book is, rather than thinking that you're going to go through this process, right? Each of the 5 pillars in, 5 weeks, and then you're done. This is an ongoing dance. This is a practice in your life, a sacred practice. And so saying goodbye is actually where I break down, how do you ritualize these transition moments? How do you bring in sacred practice to treat this as a rite of passage? And a ritual can be as simple as lighting a candle, where you are intentionally speaking to what you're letting go of and what you're inviting in. And this is a practice that I do on the regular. Anytime that I transition, and I've had so many transitions over the last year because I don't have a home. I've been living out of 2 suitcases, now 1 suitcase for over a year. And I'm moving constantly. And so anytime I leave a home that I've been staying at or a town that I've been in, I create a good goodbye ritual. And that good goodbye ritual allows me to move through those 5 pillars. And I do this, within an hour. Sometimes it's 5 minutes. Sometimes it's 3 hours. Sometimes it might be weeks long, depending on what I'm saying goodbye to. But it allows me to honor this sacred rite of passage. And it frees my heart up so that I can move forward lighter and more open to the magic that's on the other side.
And I love this idea of magic on the other side because, yes, this podcast was created to help you graduate in a more joyful way. But really, the bigger picture here is finding joy in your journey. And for some people, the journey may not include a doctorate.
Yeah.
And as you were talking through your 5 pillars, acceptance, I could just feel a weight lifted when you say, listen, you start by just accepting there's nothing here to change. That's so huge.
Absolutely.
And then deepening this understanding of the experience to ask yourself, where do you want to go? I can't tell you how many students I've worked with when I ask them why it is they're getting the degree, they realize they don't even have a clear answer.
Wow. Yeah.
And then this idea of gratitude and looking for the opportunity, and maybe it won't come right away. I'm sure you've worked with clients or even in your own experience as you're going through a goodbye, you know there's something out there, there's a reason for this, but it may not come right away, and that's okay too.
And even then, it doesn't have to be the ultimate understanding, or feeling of appreciation for having crossed over to the other side, but rather gratitude that you're in a place of transition, gratitude that you are able to reflect. Right? Like I think so many times we overlook that the simplest things that we can be grateful for are actually the most profound. I'm grateful right now that I'm feeling this grief in my heart, because I remember 20 years ago, I would shut myself off to feeling anything in my heart, right? I feel grateful that I'm in a position where I get to revisit this learning. Maybe it's a theme for some of us, right? We think we want something, but then when we get there, we realize it's not what we want, and we get to sit in that discomfort. There's magic in that. Right. And so even being grateful that you're trying to be grateful is something that I celebrate. And that just allows your nervous system to uncoil. A lot of what I teach is based on the fundamentals of being able to work with our nervous systems, which we often forget. I know we hear a lot about mindset first and all of that, right? But if we don't address our nervous systems first and get them to uncoil enough so that our mindset shifts can happen, we're just repeating mantras, we're repeating affirmations, but we don't feel any attachment or any sense of connection to them. And so in those moments where we might feel emotionally disconnected from our experience, and now I talk about gratitude, it's soften up just into the smallest things that you can be grateful for. Be grateful that you have a roof over your head, right? And then you'll start to find a little bit more to be grateful for that taps directly into this situation, this big transition that you're facing.
I love that you bring up the nervous system because I think particularly in higher education, a lot of us just use our body to bring our head around, right?
Yeah.
The body is just a transportation device. You bring your head to your Zoom meeting or your class. And I know that at the end of the show, you're going to share a practice that you have available on your website that is a centering practice that would help this uncoiling, as you say, of the nervous system.
Absolutely. So this is a practice that I have been using for over a decade. I call it the reset remedy. And the reason that it's so powerful is because it immediately helps my nervous system take a deeper breath. I mean, it's just, if you think about a transition that you're going through, you're thinking about the heartache of deciding that you don't want to finish a doctoral program. And oh my God, what are my parents going to say? What is my spouse going to say? What are my friends going to say? My colleagues? If you feel that in your body, chances are you're completely tense, right? And then the reset remedy, within seconds, that tension starts to loosen up and your body relaxes a little bit, and just enough to allow an introduction of new thoughts and emotions. And that's where we can start to do some magical work together. So I've been doing this reset remedy. I've been road tripping for so much, going to different places that I've never been to before and traveling solo with my pup Love Bug. So there are often times when I am in the road and I'm like, oh my God, I'm in the middle of nowhere. No one knows me. What if something happens? And I feel my body tense up. And then I'm just using the reset remedy as I'm driving to be able to relax a little bit enough to shift my perspective, tap back into the emotions that I want to feel. And that is a continuation of the good goodbye approach, right? Accept where I'm at. I'm feeling tense. Understand where I want to go. I want to loosen up. What's the gratitude? Wow. Phew. Okay. Reset remedy. Thank you. Now I can feel a little bit more relaxed. Look at your surroundings, Gladys. You're in a new environment. This is exciting, right? And from that emotional stance, the forgiveness can come in if needed, right? Oh, honey, there you are again, Gladys. You get so nervous, you get so wound up, but I got you. Thank God we had this opportunity to work through it and soften into this together. And then I can just release that, say goodbye, and move forward. And that happens within a couple minutes. I can't wait to share this with everybody because it becomes a very profound practice the more you use it.
And something that would be very helpful for everyone, whether you're staying in the program or you've decided your journey is taking you another way. For those types of practices, Gladys, I say, if you're in a human body, you want to know this.
Yeah.
Right? This is something you want to know.
Totally.
But I love that you transitioned that into forgiveness, because I have been in situations with countless number of students who say, I would not be able to forgive myself if I stopped this program.
Wow.
So what tips do you have in terms of this self-forgiveness? It seems so hard for us to do.
Yeah. My immediate response is, what do you envision would happen if you did forgive yourself? Being curious about our own resistance can be a tough place to navigate. And this is a practice in emotional intelligence. How do I look at what I'm saying and get curious enough to where I can tap into the emotions that are underlying this? And a lot of times there's fear, right? I mean, this is like saving everybody 5 years of therapy. If you really want to quickly get to a place where you can shift, be curious, ask that deeper question, but recognize that usually fear is underlying everything that we're having a hard time with. I mean, for me, for example, Heather, I started doing therapy and within a number of years realized it wasn't for me. And I am now doing nothing with with clinical psychology, right? I was in academia for 15 years, right? I mean, I was on the higher ed path thinking this was my ultimate career, and then got to a point where it's like I got burned out. And so everything that I've invested in professionally, emotionally, monetarily, I don't do anymore. I left all of that. And if I had stayed in a place of feeling like I needed to stay on that path because I invested hundreds of thousands or, $100,000, or, my dad and my mom worked hard to just send me to college, I would be living a life indebted to perceptions that ultimately don't serve me. I would be indebted to expectations that no longer matter. And I would be denying my own evolution. Because who I am now as a human being has evolved from where I was back then. And we forget that we have the ability to evolve within minutes, within seconds. So if one day you're committed to going down the graduate path and the next day you're like, that's not for me, how do you honor that as you evolving rather than feeling like you're quitting or you don't have what it takes, or beating yourself up and staying in that place of not forgiving yourself for changing your mind?
And, the last pillar of having this sacred practice, I just thought was so beautiful. There is something about having a ritual that gives you closure.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely.
In your book, you give so many different examples of stories from relationships ending that I just thought in a million years, I would have never thought to do that. But it was so cool.
Oh, yeah. It's needed. We're really at a time, and I mean, look at what's happening globally right now, right? We have so many infrastructures, systems that are crumbling, including the education system, that there really is a gap that is longing to be closed, where being able to bring in the spiritual lens, being able to honor ancestral practices, we've left that out of so many paradigms that we've built. And we now see the result of that. It's left us completely imbalanced. And so, for me, it starts with looking at my own family And looking at the ways that when I was a little girl, my upbringing, I denied a lot of my ancestry because I was a first generation American born Latina. I wanted to fit into the American culture. Now, oh my God. I mean, I embrace my culture more and more. I'm curious about it. I'm actively seeking to tap into my ancestral wisdom because I have learned over my lifetime that the times where I was most disconnected from myself, the times where I felt most lost, the times where I was burned out. Yes, I had a successful career. Yes, people would look at me and be like, wow, she moved up that corporate ladder, like, and super speed. I had things that people long for. But if my heart was empty and void, none of it mattered. And when I got on the spiritual path, that is where my life changed. And so it's an honor to be able to bring in that additional voice to a narrative that is saying we've got to rebalance and let's go back to remembering wisdom that's been passed down through our ancestors. Let's treat things with more sacredness. Whether it's a transition or change of relationships, the way we treat Mother Earth, there's so much more opportunity for us to look at how we live our lives individually and collectively through the lens of ritual. Again, for me, I think my contribution is having been down that corporate path and being very type A and very heady, right? Very detached from my own soul for so long, and being where I'm at now, having been assisted through beautiful healers over the years that have helped me tap back into my own knowing. I want to be able to help people realize that ritual can also be something interwoven into your day-to-day. It doesn't have to be complicated. It can be something as simple as I mentioned earlier, as lighting a candle and setting your intention. The gratitude that comes with it is immense. So I really encourage folks to look at maybe ways that their families ritualized transitions, certain moments of celebration or loss. Get curious about your ancestry, but really give yourself permission to also be playful with how you go about weaving ritual into your own life.
Towards the end of your book, you share a quote by Paulo Coelho: "If you're brave enough to say goodbye, life will reward you with a new hello."
Mm-hmm.
And I just thought that was such a nice way to wrap up everything that you taught, all the practices that you shared in the stories. And if what we're talking about is resonating with you, in the show notes, I will have details about the book. It is titled The Good Goodbye: How to Navigate Change and Loss in Life, Love, and Work. And that practice, the reset that you talked about, they can get that at your website, correct?
Correct. The reset remedy you can download if you go to drgladysato.com/gift.
And I will have that in the show notes as well. Gladys, thank you so much for taking your time to share the good goodbye. And if you're out there and realizing it's time to say goodbye to your program, or really anything that you have once held dear, then I encourage you to pick up Gladys's book so she can guide you in finding that magic that's waiting for you on the other side.
Thank you, Heather, for the opportunity to talk to your community and just what you're doing to be able to give your audience a platform where they can feel held and heard and understood by you is such a gift. So thank you for the work that you're doing.
Thanks for listening, and I look forward to connecting with you on the next episode. The Happy Doc Student Podcast is brought to you by expandyourhappy.com, and you can learn more there. Oh, and hey, if you want to make my day, would you rate, review, and subscribe to this show? Before I sign off, I do need to remind you, the information, opinions, and recommendations presented in this podcast are for general information only, and any reliance on the information provided in this podcast is done at your own risk.